In a rented house in Paris, in the spring of 1881, a woman gave birth behind a locked door and arranged for almost no one to know the child existed. The mother was the most famous beauty in Britain. The little girl would be raised on a small island far away and taught to call her own mother by another name. She would call her aunt. For nearly 20 years, she believed it. What that child was never told was that her mother had been the mistress of the man who would become king, that her real father was another prince entirely, and that the borrowed surname on her birth record belonged to a husband who had walked away long before. The most photographed woman of her age had one picture she never let anyone see. If you love the stories, the official histories smoothed over, the ones kept behind locked doors and borrowed names, subscribe and stay close, because this one only grows stranger from here. Chapter 1. The Dean's Daughter on a Small Island. On an island in the Channel, in a clergyman's house full of boys, the only girl learned early that her face turned heads. She was born Émilie Charlotte Le Breton on the 13th of October, 1853, at the Deanery of St. Saviour on Jersey, and the house she grew up in was respectable, learned, and not at all rich. Her father, the Very Reverend William Courbet Le Breton, was Dean of Jersey, the senior Anglican clergyman on the island, a tall and charming man whose reputation for charm was said to run in directions a dean's reputation was not supposed to run. Her mother, Émilie Davis Le Breton, had been a celebrated beauty in her own youth, and the daughter inherited the looks along with something harder to name, a directness that did not belong to the careful drawing rooms of the age. She was the only girl among a crowd of brothers, and she was schooled alongside the boys rather than apart from them. That single fact shaped everything that followed. While other girls of her class were taught to lower their eyes and to wait quietly for whatever a father or a husband decided, she learned to argue, to ride, to hold a room, to look a man in the face and not look away first. It gave her a confidence that her contemporaries found almost unfeminine, and that confidence would prove more valuable than any inheritance. By her teens, her beauty was famous across the island, the kind of local fame that travels by word of mouth from parish to parish, and she had already grasped the lesson that would carry her further than birth or money ever could. A beautiful woman who knew she was beautiful and was not ashamed of the knowledge held a kind of power that the rules of her world had no way to take from her. It is worth picturing the world she was born into, because she would spend her life breaking its rules. The Jersey of the 1850s and 60s was a small, church-going, intricately respectable place, where a dean's family stood near the top of a modest local order, and a girl's whole future was understood to depend on the marriage she could make. There was no other career, no other route to security or standing. A woman was her father's daughter, and then her husband's wife, and the years in between were a brief market in which her looks and her manners were the only goods she had to trade. Lillie understood this market with a clarity that was unusual in someone so young, and she understood, too, that on an island this small, the market was painfully thin. What the island could not give her was a way off it. Jersey was beautiful, and it was a cage, and a dean's daughter with no dowry had very few routes into the wider world she could feel waiting across the water. The route that arrived was a man named Edward Langtry. He was a widower of Irish landed background, older than she was, with money and shipping and, most importantly of all, a yacht. To a girl who had spent her life looking out at a Britain she had never properly seen, the yacht was not a toy. It was a passport. He could lift her off the island, and at 20 years old, with the market closing around her, that was reason enough. They married on the 9th of March, 1874, in her father's own church, the same St. Saviour's where she had been christened and where, in the fullness of a long and astonishing life, she would one day be buried. It was a marriage built on what the husband could offer, rather than on anything the wife felt, and it gave her exactly one thing of lasting value. It gave her the name she would make famous across 2 continents. Almost everything else about it was already failing before it began. Edward Langtry's fortune was thinner than it looked, his ambition thinner still, and his fondness for drink would only deepen with the passing years. He had wanted a beautiful wife to admire across a dinner table. He had married a woman who intended to be seen by the entire world, and the entire world did not include him. For a while they lived quietly, and the quiet very nearly swallowed her. A great beauty marooned in a small and shrinking life is a tragedy waiting to be either wasted or unleashed, and for 2 years it looked as though hers would simply be wasted. Then, in 1876, the Langtrys moved to London, and the woman who would become a legend stepped off the boat with no money, no title, and no connections at all. Within 2 years, she would be the most painted face in Britain. The question that hung over her arrival was the question her whole life would answer. How does a clergyman's daughter from a Channel island, carrying nothing but a face and a will, conquer the most snobbish society on earth? Chapter 2. One black dress conquers London. She arrived in London with no money, no title, and no connections, and within 2 years she was the most painted woman in Britain. The turning point was a single evening and a single dress. Invited to a reception at the home of Lady Seabright in the spring of 1876, she came in a plain black gown, the dress of mourning, with her hair simply done and no jewels at all, into a room full of women armoured in silk and diamonds. The effect was not modesty. The effect was a knife. Against all that ornament, she looked like the only real person in the room, and the room turned to her as if a light had been carried in. Among the guests were artists and writers, and the kind of titled men whose opinion decided who in London mattered, and by the end of the night, they had all quietly decided that she did. The painters came first, and the painters made her official. John Everett Millais, himself a Jersey man and one of the most celebrated artists of the age, painted her with a flower in her hand in 1878 and called the picture a Jersey lily, and the nickname fixed itself so hard that it has outlived everything else about her. Other great names wanted her on their canvases. Edward Poynter painted her. The whole aesthetic set, with the young Oscar Wilde among her loudest and most theatrical champions, took her up as the living proof of their creed that beauty needed no other justification than itself. To be painted by these men was to be certified, and she was certified again and again until her face was no longer merely admired. It had become a documented feature of the cultural landscape, a thing the nation agreed to look at. Then came the photographs, and the photographs changed the scale of everything. For the first time in human history, a single face could be reproduced cheaply and sold by the thousand, and of all the faces in Britain, the new machinery chose hers. Consider the numbers, because they describe a kind of fame that had simply never existed before. Postcard portraits of the Jersey lily appeared in shop windows the length and breadth of the country, bought for a few pence by clerks and shopgirls and housewives who would never set foot in any drawing room she would ever enter, carried home, pinned up, and pored over by tens of thousands of strangers who knew her face far better than they knew their own neighbours. A clergyman's daughter from an island of a few square miles had become, within roughly 2 years, and on nothing but her looks, one of the most reproduced human images on earth. The Victorians invented a phrase for the new kind of woman she had become, and the phrase carried a sneer folded inside it. They called her a professional beauty, a woman whose entire occupation, whose whole reason for public existence was to be looked at. There had been famous beauties before, of course, in every age, but they had been famous within a closed world of the court and the aristocracy. Lillie Langtry was famous in the modern way, famous to the masses, famous to people who had no other connection to her than the penny image in the shop window. She was, in everything but the word, the first celebrity in the sense the 20th century would come to understand, and she had grasped the machinery of it instinctively before anyone had even named the thing she was doing. The sneer in the phrase pointed at an uncomfortable truth, which was that there was no fortune beneath any of this. The Langtrys were spending money they did not have to maintain the appearance a famous beauty required. The gowns, the carriage, the address, the endless small expenses of being seen in the right places. Edward's failing income could not begin to cover it, and the gap between the dazzling public surface and the cracking private foundation widened with every season. The fame was entirely real, and the debts were entirely real, and the two were running hard in opposite directions. She had built a public self of astonishing brightness on a base that was already beginning to give way beneath her feet. But the fame did its work before the foundation collapsed, and the work it did was to carry her toward the centre of everything. To be the most talked about woman in London in those years was to be drawn, as if by gravity, toward the true centre of London society. And the true centre was not the artists or the photographers or the aesthetes. The true centre was a stout, restless, pleasure-loving man in his middle 30s who happened to be the heir to the throne of the largest empire the world had ever known. The most desirable woman in England was about to be noticed by the most powerful man in it. And she had not come all this way, from the deanery to the shop windows, with any intention of being merely noticed. Chapter 3. The beauty becomes the prince's mistress. The most desirable man in England wanted her, and she made certain he kept wanting her. Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, was in his middle 30s when the Jersey Lily crossed his path around 1877, and she was 23. He was the most indulged man in the kingdom, kept from any real responsibility by a mother who did not trust him, married to the patient and long-suffering Danish Princess Alexandra, and entirely accustomed to taking whatever pleased him from the wives and the daughters of his glittering circle. What was unusual was not that he wanted Lillie Langtry. Half the men in London wanted Lillie Langtry. What was unusual was the way she received the wanting, not as a flustered subject overwhelmed by royal attention, but as a player who understood the game perfectly well and meant to take her own winnings from it. She became his acknowledged mistress, and the word acknowledged is the whole heart of the matter. This was not a hidden thing, conducted in shadows and denied in daylight. In the social world of the Marlborough House set, the fast, rich, fashionable circle that gathered around the heir and took its name from his London house, Lillie Langtry was received openly as the prince's favourite. She was seated near him at dinners, photographed in the same gatherings, invited wherever he was invited, her position understood by every person who mattered, and tolerated precisely because the prince willed it to be tolerated. For a dowerless clergyman's daughter from Jersey, it was an ascent so steep it should have left her dizzy. Instead, she stood on it perfectly steadily and put it to use. The mechanics of such an affair, in that age, were a kind of quiet industry, and they are worth understanding because they explain so much of what came later. A royal mistress was not simply a lover. She was an institution with its own machinery, a discreet country address where the pair could meet away from London eyes, a sympathetic circle sworn to see nothing, and above all, a husband managed into silence and absence. At Bournemouth, on the south coast, a house was associated with these years, a private place fitted to her taste and far from the cameras. And the husband, Edward Langtry, the man who had brought her to the mainland in the first place, was by now a sad and shrinking figure at the very edge of his own wife's life, drinking and complaining and entirely unable to halt anything that was happening to him. It is tempting to tell this stretch of the story as the tale of a powerful man and a fortunate girl, the prince elevating the pretty nobody, but the weight of the evidence points firmly the other way, and the truth of it is the spine of everything that follows. She was not the prince's passive trophy. By the reckoning of the people who knew her, and of the biographers who have studied her since, she was the active strategist of her own rise, the one who chose the gown, who placed herself where he would be, who steered the conversations and managed the meetings, who treated the affair as a campaign to be won rather than a piece of luck to be enjoyed. The face was the weapon, but the will behind the face was the soldier, and it was the will that won the ground. What the position bought her was glittering, and for a time, total. The association with the heir to the throne turned the famous beauty into something close to a queen of fashion, a woman whose mere presence at an event certified that the event mattered, whose choice of dress was copied, whose movements were followed. She had reached the very summit of the only career her world allowed a woman, the career of being desired by the right man. From the deanery on a small island, she had climbed, in a handful of years, to the side of the man who would one day be king. There was, in the logic of her age, nowhere higher left to go. And that was precisely the danger, because no reign of that kind lasts. A royal favourite is a seasonal flower, admired while she is in bloom and replaced the moment the next one opens. And by the closing years of the 1870s, the prince's restless attention was already beginning to drift, as it always eventually drifted, towards someone newer. A lesser woman might have clung or wept or simply faded out of the light and back into the obscurity she had come from. Lillie Langtry did something far more dangerous than any of that. As the future king's interest cooled, she did not wait to be discarded. She found herself a second prince. And the second prince would prove very much harder to manage than the first, because the second prince was young and unmarried, and fell genuinely and recklessly in love. Chapter 4. A Second Prince in the Shadows. While the future king's interest was cooling, a young naval officer with royal blood began to call on her. His name was Prince Louis of Battenberg, and in 1880 he was a fair-haired, handsome lieutenant in the Royal Navy in his middle 20s, the son of a marriage that placed him among the minor princelings of the German states, grand enough in blood to be a prince, and modest enough in standing to need a career. He was clever, ambitious, and serious about his profession, in a way the pleasure-seeking Prince of Wales had never had any reason to be. In the long run of his life, he would rise to the very summit of the British Navy, but all of that lay decades in the future. In 1880, he was simply a young man of royal blood who had fallen hard for the most famous woman in England. The danger of the situation can hardly be overstated, and Lillie Langtry, who calculated everything, must have understood every inch of it. To be the mistress of the Prince of Wales was a position of a kind, perilous but defined, governed by rules that everyone involved understood and observed. To carry on a second affair at the same time with another prince, while the first prince was only beginning to lose interest rather than having safely and finally let go, was to walk a tightrope stretched over a pit. If the two affairs collided, if the cooling older prince felt slighted or mocked, if the ardent younger one refused to stay discreet, the whole carefully built structure of her position could come crashing down at once, and there would be no rebuilding it. And the younger man was the loose thread in the whole design, because where the older prince had always treated love as a pastime to be picked up and set down, Louis of Battenberg seems to have treated it as something very near the real and dangerous thing. To understand why she took the risk, it helps to see how far her ground had already shifted beneath her by 1880. She was no longer the untouchable favourite she had been 3 years before. Her finances were a slow-motion catastrophe. Her marriage was a hollow ruin propped up only for appearance. And the protection of the older prince, the protection that had made her socially bulletproof, was thinning by the month as his attention wandered. She was a woman watching her single great asset, her position, begin to slip from her hands, with no fortune of her own to fall back on and no respectable way to earn one. Into that widening gap walked a young man who adored her without calculation, and for once in her closely managed life she did not hold a man at the careful distance she held everyone else. The affair ran through 1880, intense and increasingly unguarded, and it is the one stretch of her whole life where the famous calculation appears genuinely to have slipped, where appetite or affection or simple exhausted recklessness seems to have outrun the strategy. Perhaps she loved him. Perhaps she was frightened, and he was kind. Perhaps, with the older prince drifting away, she half meant the young naval officer to be a lifeline rather than a luxury. The records do not let us see inside her on this point, and it would be dishonest to pretend they do. What the records show plainly is the consequence, and the consequence was enormous. By the middle of 1880, Lillie Langtry was pregnant, and her husband was beyond any doubt not the father, and the question of who was would echo for more than 100 years. The obvious answer, the answer her own circle reached for, and the answer that history has largely accepted, was Prince Louis of Battenberg. He was her lover, he was present, and he had both the means and the royal blood to turn the pregnancy into a catastrophe for 2 great families at once. When his relations came to understand what had happened, they would move with a cold and practiced speed that tells its own story about how seriously the danger was taken at the very top of European society. It is worth pausing here to see the whole situation as the age itself would have seen it, because the cruelty of it lay in the rules rather than in any one person. In the world Lillie moved through, a man of rank could keep a mistress, father a child, and walk away from both with his name and his prospects entirely untouched, while the woman bore the entire weight of the consequence in her own body and her own ruined reputation. The same society that had crowded to admire her in the shop windows would have turned its back on her without a second thought the moment her condition became visible and undeniable. There was no version of this story in which the men involved risked what she risked. The prince who had loved her would marry well and reign. The young officer would sail away and rise. Only the woman stood to lose everything she had built, and she knew it, and she had gambled anyway. That, more than any single choice, is the measure of how trapped she truly was beneath all the glitter, and of how little the famous power to be looked at could protect her once the powerful decided she had become a problem. But the obvious answer is not the only answer the surviving records will allow, and an honest telling has to say so. There was, in the background of her life, another man entirely, a man from the island, a man whose name barely appears anywhere in the glittering London story, and who may nonetheless have been closer to her in those very years than anyone around her ever knew. The certainty that the father was a prince, the certainty the whole legend has always rested upon, would one day be quietly disturbed by a bundle of old letters that no one had ever been meant to read. Chapter 5. The letters that complicate everything. For a century, the father seemed settled, until a bundle of love letters surfaced and reopened the question. The man at the centre of the doubt was Arthur Clarence Jones, born in 1854 and dead in 1930, a Jersey man, a childhood friend of Lillie's brother's, and a fixture of the island world she had come from before London ever heard her name. He belonged to that world by blood as well as by friendship, for by an awkward family arrangement he was the brother of one of her sisters-in-law, and both he and that sister were the illegitimate children of an English peer, Lord Ranelagh. Jones, in other words, belonged precisely to the part of Lillie's life that the dazzling London legend left out, the part rooted in the deanery and the harbours and the people who had known her as a girl before she was the Jersey Lillie. And for the best part of 100 years, his name meant nothing whatever to the story. Then, in 1978, the letters came to light. They were letters written by Lillie herself to Arthur Jones, and when the biographer Laura Beatty quoted from them in a study published in 1999, they changed the whole shape of the question. The letters give every impression of an intimate relationship, or at the very least, an intimacy that ran far closer than friendship, and they run through the very years in which the famous royal affairs were unfolding. They do not prove that Jones fathered her daughter, and no honest account should claim that they do, but they place a credible third man in the room at the exact moment the legend had always insisted there were only two, and once a credible third man stands in the room, the tidy royal answer can no longer be the only one on the table. Set against that doubt, however, is a careful and persuasive piece of historical detective work pointing the other way. The historian Jane Ridley, working directly from the surviving diary of the Prince of Wales, compared the dates. She established that Prince Louis of Battenberg was staying at Marlborough House on the 27th of June, 1880, which falls squarely upon the most likely date of conception. That is not proof either, but it is exactly the kind of quiet, documented coincidence that serious historians weigh heavily, and it pulls the balance back toward the prince. The Battenberg family, for their part, never entertained a moment's doubt about it. Louis's own son, who grew up to become Earl Mountbatten of Burma and one of the most powerful men in 20th century Britain, maintained firmly to the end of his long and famous life that his father was the father of Lillie Langtry's child. So the only honest position, the one this telling will hold to, is that the paternity is genuinely uncertain, and that the most that can be stated as fact is what the people closest to it believed at the time. They believed it was Battenberg. Lillie led Battenberg himself to believe it was Battenberg. The settlements that followed were arranged on the shared understanding that it was Battenberg. Whatever the truth of the biology, which no living person can now recover, the social fact, the fact that drove every single decision that came next, was that a prince of royal blood had got the most famous woman in England with child, and that something had to be done about it, quickly and quietly, before the entire world found out. There is a further reason the question of the father can never now be fully closed, and it is the same reason so much of this story has had to be pieced together from the margins. Lillie herself spent the rest of her long life making certain the record stayed incomplete. The memoir she would eventually publish, late in life, treats the royal affair in soft and flattering outline and leaves out the pregnancy, the secret birth, and the daughter entirely, as though that whole stretch of her life had simply never occurred. Everything we know about the affair with the young prince, and about the shadow of the island friend behind it, has had to be assembled by biographers working from letters, diaries, settlements, and the comparison of dates against the steady resistance of a woman who had every reason to keep the truth buried and the skill to keep it buried well. The doubt about the father is not, in other words, a gap that better research might one day close. It is a silence she built deliberately, brick by brick, and maintained to the end. This is the precise point at which the story turns from scandal into machinery, because the machinery of that age was extraordinarily good at exactly this kind of problem. Inconvenient pregnancies attached to powerful men were nothing new, and the great families kept a well-practiced method for making them vanish from public view. Money changed hands in private. A husband was paid to look the other way, or encouraged to be conveniently abroad. A young officer found himself handed a sudden posting that happened to lie on the far side of the world. And the woman at the centre of it all, however famous, however clever, however adored, discovered that all her hard-won power to be seen counted for precisely nothing the moment the powerful needed her instead to be invisible. Whoever the father truly was, the consequence for her was identical. By the autumn of 1880, Lillie Langtry was a pregnant woman whom everyone around her urgently needed to disappear. Chapter 6. Pregnant, abandoned, and sent away. In the summer of 1880, she was pregnant, her husband gone, and both princes suddenly out of reach. The collapse of her position, when it finally came, was swift and very nearly total. Edward Langtry, her husband, the man whose name she carried and whose yacht had once carried her, had by now effectively walked out of the marriage altogether, his pride and his patience and what remained of his money all spent, leaving her without the one thing a respectable woman in trouble was supposed always to be able to fall back upon: a husband to stand between her and the scandal and absorb the blame. The Prince of Wales, the great protector of her glory years, was no longer her lover and could not possibly be seen to involve himself in cleaning up a mess fathered by another man. And that other man, the young naval prince who had adored her so recklessly, was about to be removed from the board entirely. The Prince of Wales did one quiet thing in this crisis that tells the whole story of how such matters were managed at the top of society. He lent her £2,000 to clear her debts. It was a substantial sum, the kind of money that buys silence and breathing space and a graceful disappearance from public view, and the manner of it is as telling as the amount. It was not the gesture of a lover, for he was a lover no longer. It was the gesture of a worldly man managing an embarrassment, helping an old favourite slip cleanly out of the light before her changing figure could become a story in the illustrated papers. The famous woman who had been kept so brilliantly on display was now being paid, gently and discreetly, to take herself off the stage she had worked so hard to command. The Battenberg family moved faster still, and far more coldly. The instant it became clear that Lillie was pregnant and that their Louis was the presumed father, they acted with the ruthless efficiency of an old dynasty protecting its bloodline. An aide was dispatched from the family seat at Jugendheim, in Germany, to arrange a financial settlement, the quiet transfer of money that acknowledged a responsibility while admitting absolutely nothing in public. Louis was told plainly, and not by anyone who cared what he wanted, that there could be no question whatever of marriage. A prince of his blood did not marry a married actress trailing a decade of scandal behind her, however genuine his feelings, and his feelings were simply not part of the discussion. And then the Navy, with a timing far too convenient to be coincidence, suddenly discovered a posting for him. On the 17th of October, 1880, Prince Louis of Battenberg sailed away aboard a warship bound on a voyage around the world that would keep him at sea for roughly 2 years. The ship carried a name that no novelist would have dared invent. She was called the Inconstant. The young man who had loved the most famous woman in England recklessly enough to father her child, if indeed he was the father, was carried off across the oceans before that child was even born. His ardour quietly filed away as a diplomatic inconvenience, and his whole future smoothly redirected back toward the proper marriage and the proper career that had always been waiting for him. He had been, in the end, no freer than she was. The great families disposed of their sons almost as briskly as they disposed of their sons' mistresses. Spare a thought, in passing, for the husband whose name sat at the centre of all this arranging, because Edward Langtry's part in the story is a quiet tragedy of its own. He had walked out of the marriage, by the accounts that survive, in the wake of a libel case, his pride and his finances both in tatters, and from that point he drifts steadily toward the edge of his own life and out of it. The man who had once owned the yacht that carried a beautiful island girl to the mainland, who had given her the very name that was now being printed on a secret birth record in France, ended his days a broken and forgotten figure, and would die in 1897, reportedly in an asylum near Chester, far from the glittering world his wife had conquered without him. He had wanted to be admired, and instead he had become useful, a surname to be borrowed and a husband to be managed. And then he had become nothing at all. The machinery that disposed so neatly of the princes had disposed of him first and most completely. That left only the woman, and the woman was now some 4 months pregnant and very nearly alone. The husband was gone. The older prince had paid and withdrawn behind his discretion. The younger prince was steaming toward the far side of the planet, and the great machinery of concealment now did the last thing it had been built to do. It made her vanish. She was spirited quietly across the channel into France, away from every camera and every gossip and every shop window that held her photograph, to wait out the remaining months in a place where the single most recognizable face in Britain was merely another foreign woman in a rented room. There is a terrible symmetry in it that the story never lets us forget. The Jersey Lillie, who had built her entire existence on the principle of being seen, was about to do the one thing she had spent her whole life refusing to do. She was about to disappear. Chapter 7. A daughter born behind a locked door. She was spirited across the channel to France, and in a quiet room the secret was born. The confinement, by the accounts that have come down through the biographers, took place in Paris, the one great city near enough to reach and large enough to swallow a famous woman whole, where a foreigner could vanish into a private apartment and emerge months later with no one in London any the wiser. There was no public announcement, no gathering of relations, none of the ritual and ceremony that ordinarily surrounded the birth of a child to a woman of any standing at all. There was a locked door, a small number of trusted people, and the ordinary, frightening, entirely private labour of bringing a child into the world, performed by a woman who understood with perfect clarity that the whole purpose of the exercise was that the world must never be allowed to connect this child to her. On the 18th of March, 1881, she gave birth to a daughter, and the child was named Jeanne Marie. Some of the older accounts place the date a few days earlier in the same month, and that small uncertainty is itself a symptom of the secrecy, because a birth deliberately arranged to leave no trace does not leave a clean and confident record behind it either. What is not in any doubt at all is the single most telling detail of the entire affair, the detail that fixes the whole tragedy in one stroke of a pen. When the child was registered, she was registered under the surname Langtry, the name of the husband who had walked out of the marriage, the man who was beyond the slightest doubt not her father. The borrowed name was the first brick laid in a wall that would take 20 years to build and that would never quite be pulled down. Pause on the cold arithmetic of that single decision, because it is the frozen centre of the whole story. The mother was perhaps the most photographed woman in the entire world. The presumed father was a prince of royal blood, descended from the old houses of Europe. The legal father, the man whose name the baby would carry through her childhood, was a bankrupt and increasingly drunken figure who had abandoned the marriage and contributed nothing to the situation but a surname he no longer even wished to see associated with himself. A child of the most extraordinary parentage imaginable was being handed the identity of the one man in the entire story who had nothing whatever to offer her, and she was being handed it for the simplest and coldest of reasons. His was the only name that could be used without bringing the whole towering edifice of her mother's reputation down in ruins. The lie was not careless or improvised. The lie was engineered, and it was engineered very well. What had been gained and what had been spent can be set plainly side by side, because Lillie Langtry's whole life was a series of transactions, and this was the largest of them. Gained were the things she could not bear to lose. Her name was left unstained enough to be salvageable. Her freedom was preserved to reappear one day in London as something other than a ruined woman with an acknowledged royal bastard at her skirts. Her entire future as a public figure was protected against the single catastrophe that an openly admitted illegitimate child would certainly have been. Spent against all of that was a daughter, handed at the very first hour of her life into an arrangement designed to deny her, for 2 full decades, the simplest and most basic knowledge any human being possesses, the knowledge of who her own mother was. It was a bargain, and like all of Lillie Langtry's great bargains, it was shrewd, and it worked, and it cost exactly one thing that could never afterward be bought back at any price. There is a bleak completeness to the secrecy that is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it inverts everything Lillie Langtry had made of herself. For 5 years, she had been the most visible woman in the country, a face reproduced and sold by the thousand, a person whose entire genius lay in being seen by as many strangers as possible. And now, at the single most important event of her private life, the birth of her own child, she summoned the exact opposite of all that machinery. No photograph was taken, no notice was printed, no friends were gathered to admire the baby. The most documented woman of her age produced the one human being most closely bound to her in conditions of near total darkness, and arranged matters so that the darkness would hold for 20 years. It is the clearest proof in the whole story that her relationship to being seen was never innocent and never accidental. She understood visibility as a tool, to be wielded when it served her, and withheld absolutely when it threatened her. And on the day her daughter was born, it threatened her more than anything ever had. The baby could not remain in Paris, and she could not be raised in London under her mother's eye, because to raise her openly anywhere within reach was to confess the whole of it. So the child was sent away again, across another stretch of grey water, to the small island where the entire story had begun. Jeanne Marie Langtry was carried to Jersey, to be brought up among the very same parishes and harbours her mother had once schemed so hard to escape, by people who could be trusted to tell her a careful and consistent story about who she was and where she had come from. And the heart of that story, the lie that would shape the child's whole understanding of herself for 20 years, came down in the end to a single, quietly misapplied word. She would be taught to call her mother her aunt. Chapter 8. The child who called her aunt. The baby was sent to the island to be raised by family and given a story about who she was. The arrangement settled on Jersey, in the orbit of the deanery, where the child was placed first in the care of her grandmother, the elder Émilie Le Breton, who now became, in the daily reality of the little girl's life, something far closer to a mother than the glamorous and infrequent figure who occasionally swept in from the mainland. As the years passed and circumstances shifted within the family, the care passed onward among Lily's relations, but the essential fiction held perfectly firm throughout it all. Jeanne Marie grew up believing herself a Langtry by blood and an orphan, or something very near one by circumstance, and she grew up believing that the dazzling, famous, frequently absent woman who arrived from London with her trunks and her stories was simply her aunt. Pause on the sheer strangeness of it, because it is genuinely strange. Children are not easily deceived about the people standing closest to them, and yet this particular deception held firm for the better part of 20 years, sustained year upon year by an entire family's quiet willingness to keep one small word in its place. The grandmother knew. The brothers knew. The handful of trusted people who had been present at the edges of the Paris confinement knew. And around the growing girl, through every birthday and every Christmas and every ordinary island afternoon, they maintained the gentle, total, unbroken lie that the woman who had carried her was nothing more than a relative who came to visit. It is here that the great refrain of this whole life states itself most plainly. The most photographed woman of her age kept one picture the world was never allowed to see. The hidden picture was not of her famous face, which the entire nation had seen 1,000 times over in the shop windows. The hidden picture was of herself, holding her own daughter, and being called by the one true name she would not claim. For Lillie, the cruelty of the arrangement had a brutal internal logic, and she lived inside that logic for 2 decades without any recorded flinch. To acknowledge Jeanne was to detonate everything she had spent her life building and rebuilding. It would confirm the affair beyond denial. It would force the question of the father. It would summon down the exact scandal she had spent the £2,000 and the silent months in Paris and the whole of her formidable cunning to avoid. An unacknowledged child on a distant island was a manageable secret, painful, but contained. An acknowledged daughter living in a London house was a permanent and unanswerable headline. And so she chose, over and over again, across the entire length of the girl's childhood, the secret over the daughter, the unstained name over the living child, the future over the one person in the whole arrangement who had been given no say in any of it. There is, to be fair, a kinder reading of the choice, and honesty requires that it be set down beside the harsher one. It can be said, with some truth, that a child raised quietly and securely on Jersey by a loving grandmother was genuinely spared the savage public glare that an openly illegitimate royal child would certainly have suffered in that age. The whispers, the cruelty, the lifelong label. There is something in that. The kindest reading of Lillie's decision leans its full weight upon it, and it is not nothing. But the kindest reading cannot quite stretch to cover the sheer length of the deception, the number of years across which a growing girl was deliberately allowed to misunderstand the single most basic fact of her own existence. Whatever protection the arrangement offered the child, it doubled at every moment as concealment for the mother, and the reputation it protected most reliably and most completely was never the daughter's. It was Lillie's own. It helps, in weighing all this, to understand how heavily the age punished illegitimacy, because that weight is the whole reason the lie seemed worth its terrible cost. A child born outside marriage in Victorian Britain carried a stain that the law and the church and polite society all conspired to make permanent, a mark on the birth record and on every prospect that followed from it, narrowing the marriages such a child could make, and the doors that would open to them for the whole of a life. For a child who was also the secret offspring of a famous mother and a foreign prince, the cruelty would have been redoubled, the whispers following her into every room. Quiet, fostering arrangements of exactly this kind, a child handed to a grandmother or an aunt and raised under a softened version of the truth, were one of the few mercies the system offered. And they were common enough that the island family would have known precisely how the thing was done, none of which quite answers the deeper charge that the mercy to the child and the protection of the mother were, in this case, the very same act, and that only one of the two of them had any choice in the matter. And while the child was being raised inside the careful island story, the woman who had authored that story was facing a catastrophe of her own back on the mainland, one that had nothing to do with the baby and everything to do with money. The fame had never once been matched by a fortune. The husband's resources were entirely gone. The accumulated bills of a decade of brilliant public living were all coming due at the same moment. The Jersey Lily, the favourite of princes, the face in every shop window in the kingdom, was about to be ruined in the most ordinary and unglamorous way imaginable. She was about to run clean out of money. And what she chose to do about it would have been very nearly unthinkable for a woman of her birth even a generation before. She decided that she would earn her own. Chapter 9. Ruined, she walks onto a stage. Bankrupt and disgraced, she did the unthinkable for a woman of her birth. She went to work. The financial collapse that had been building quietly for years arrived in full at the start of the 1880s, as her husband's affairs disintegrated entirely and the accumulated debts of her famous public life closed in around her from every side. A clergyman's daughter, who had married a gentleman, however, failed and faded a gentleman he had become, was simply not supposed to work for money. Paid work, real public work, performed in front of strangers for a wage, was one of the hardest lines the age drew, the line that separated the respectable from everyone below them, and a lady who stepped across it was understood to have fallen clean out of her class, finally and for good. It was a step that ordinarily confirmed ruin rather than offering any escape from it. Lillie Langtry looked steadily at that line, and then at the only alternative, which was a slow slide into genteel poverty and quiet obscurity, and she stepped across it without any recorded hesitation at all. In 1881, the very same year in which her secret daughter was born in that locked Paris room, she went onto the professional stage. She did it with the backing of the most respected theatrical management of the day, and she did it as the first British woman of her social rank ever to become a working actress, a genuine and deliberate breach of the social order that scandalized precisely the same people who had once flocked and jostled to be near her. The face that had been certified by the great painters and sold by the thousand in the photographers' windows was now to be hired out, performance by performance, evening by evening, to anyone at all who could afford the price of a theatre ticket. The professional beauty, the woman whose occupation had been simply to be looked at, had become a professional in the older, harder, and far less genteel sense of the word. She was not, at the beginning, a great actress, and the honest accounts of the period freely admit it. What she was, instead, was a phenomenon, and a phenomenon could fill a theatre night after night, whether or not it could fully command the stage it stood upon. People came in their crowds to see the Jersey Lily in the living flesh, the woman the prince had loved, the face they knew from the shop windows, the heroine of the great whispered scandal. And they came in such numbers and paid so willingly that her limitations as a performer mattered far less than her sheer power as an attraction. Around her gathered once again the same aesthetic and artistic world that had taken her up at the very start, with Oscar Wilde among those who actively encouraged her toward the stage and helped to turn her notoriety into something that could be sold by the seat. The scandal that ought by every rule of the age to have buried her had been quietly repackaged, with her own energetic help, into the very thing that now sold the tickets. There is a hard irony sitting at the centre of this reinvention, and it is the same irony the whole story keeps circling back to and refusing to release. The very ruin that destroyed her social standing was what finally freed her to make her own independent way in the world. As long as she had been a respectable wife and a kept beauty, she had been wholly dependent on a husband who failed her and a prince who in time tired of her, with no income of her own and no real control over the direction of her fate. Bankruptcy and disgrace stripped all of that comfortable dependence away, and in stripping it away, they handed her something that no respectable Victorian woman of her class was ever supposed to be permitted to hold. They handed her a reason, and with it, a kind of permission, to earn. The fall did not finish her, as it had finished so many women before her. The fall, against every expectation, set her loose. It is hard, from this distance, to feel quite how shocking the decision was at the time, but the shock is essential to the story. The English stage of the 1880s was not yet the respectable profession it would slowly become. Actresses, however celebrated, were widely regarded as standing only a step or two above the demi-monde, women whose bodies were displayed for money and whose virtue was assumed to be for sale along with the tickets. For a woman of Lillie's birth, the daughter of a dean, once the intimate of the heir to the throne, to walk deliberately onto that stage was to announce to the whole of society that she had given up any claim to be treated as a lady. It was, in the strict terms of her class, a kind of social death, freely chosen. And yet she chose it with open eyes, because she had understood something the people scandalized by her never did. The respectability she was throwing away had only ever been borrowed, dependent on the goodwill of men who had already begun to withdraw it. The income she could earn on the stage, by contrast, would be hers, and no prince and no husband and no whispering drawing room could take it from her. And once she was loose, she did not stay on the modest stages of London, where the old scandal could still follow her like a shadow into every drawing room and whisper behind every fan. She turned her gaze west instead, across an ocean far wider than the narrow channel that separated her from the daughter she had hidden, toward a vast new country that did not greatly care which English prince had once loved her and cared enormously, hungrily, that she was famous. She turned her gaze toward America, and America was about to take the ruined mistress of a future king and remake her into one of the wealthiest self-made women of the entire age. Chapter 10. The highest paid woman in America. She crossed the Atlantic and turned a scandalous name into one of the largest fortunes any actress had ever earned. America received Lillie Langtry exactly as a woman in her position must have prayed a new world would, without the suffocating generational class memory of the old one. To Americans, she was not a fallen woman who had broken the sacred rules of her caste and deserved to be cut for it. She was a celebrity, an English beauty with a thrilling royal scandal trailing behind her like expensive perfume. And they paid, lavishly and repeatedly, and across years of touring, simply to be in the same room and breathe the same air as her. Over a series of American tours, she became one of the highest paid actresses in the entire English-speaking world, and the money that she made, for the first time in the whole of her life, was entirely and unarguably her own. Stand back for a moment and measure the distance she had travelled to reach that point, because the distance is the thing. She had begun as a dowerless girl on a few square miles of Channel Island, married off at 20 for the sake of a yacht. She had arrived in London with nothing in her hands but a face. She had risen on the arm of one prince and very nearly drowned on the arm of a second. She had been quietly paid £2,000 to vanish from public view, and she had given away her own newborn daughter to a borrowed name on a distant island in order to keep her own name usable. And now, on the strength of that very name, and that very face, and the very scandal that should have destroyed her, she was banking sums of money that no woman of her original background could have dreamed of earning by any path her world considered respectable. The beauty that had once been a possession for other people to display had become, at last, a business that she alone owned and ran and profited from. She spent the fortune she had made in exactly the manner she had earned it, entirely on her own terms and answerable to no one. She kept a country home, Regal Lodge, which remained in her hands for more than 20 years, a settled base in England to which she returned between her travels and her work. A house that received over those decades a long parade of celebrated guests, including, in a neat closing of an old circle, the very prince whose love had first launched her into the light. She built a racing stable and put her own money and her own name openly onto the turf, in an age when a woman owning and running racehorses in her own right was its own small and deliberate scandal. She bought property, and she sold it again at the timing of her own choosing. She had become, in every practical sense that mattered, a self-made magnate, a woman in complete command of her income, her movements, and her own future, which was precisely the freedom that her birth and her marriage had so completely denied her, and which only ruin, of all things, had finally allowed her to seize with both hands. The scale of what she built for herself can be measured in bricks and acres as much as in applause. Regal Lodge, her English base, stayed in her hands for some 23 years before she finally let it go, a house grand enough across those decades to receive the most celebrated guests in the land, the old prince among them. In her later years, through her second marriage, she would be mistress of a string of country properties in Sussex, one house of 17 bedrooms set in 71 acres, another of 10 bedrooms in 52 acres, and a farm of more than 200 acres beyond them, the whole portfolio held and then sold off together as she reordered her life. Set that against the dowerless girl who had needed another man's yacht simply to leave her island, and the distance she had travelled becomes almost dizzying. The woman who had once owned nothing now owned land, horses, houses, and her own name outright. And every acre of it had been bought with money she herself had earned by standing in front of strangers and being looked at. And yet a fortune, however large it grows, can only ever buy the things that happen to be for sale. It could buy houses and racehorses and gowns and independence and the loud, glittering public proof that she had not in the end been beaten by the men and the rules that had tried to beat her. What it could not buy, what no tour and no triumph and no banked fortune could ever buy back for her, was the single relationship she had traded away at the very beginning of all of it. While the mother was crossing and recrossing oceans and filling great theatres and counting a self-made fortune that astonished 2 continents, the daughter was growing up quietly on Jersey, turning slowly from a child into a young woman, still living inside the careful island story, still calling her mother her aunt. The most successful and relentless self-promotion of the entire age had one account upon its books that it could never, by any means, be made to settle. And that account was kept in the heart of a girl who did not yet know whose daughter she truly was. That girl was now approaching the age at which the careful story could no longer possibly hold. A small child can be told without much difficulty that a visiting relative is an aunt and will believe it. A grown young woman, standing on the very edge of her own marriage and her own independent life, beginning to ask the natural and unavoidable questions about where she had come from and who her parents had really been, is a far harder audience to keep in the dark. The wall of the borrowed name had stood, unbreached, for very nearly 2 decades. It was about to be broken through at last, not gently and emphatically, not at any moment of the mother's careful choosing. The long lie was about to come face to face with the one person it had been built entirely around, and she was about to be told the truth. Chapter 11. The lie comes apart. Around her 20th year, the daughter was finally told who her father was, and the bitterness it left in her never fully healed. The exact shape of the revelation is, like the birth that set it all in motion, slightly blurred by the very secrecy that had surrounded the whole affair from the start. And an honest telling has to admit the blur rather than paper over it. By the most widely accepted account, Jeanne Marie learned the true identity of her father when she was around 20 years old, near the turn of the new century, and the person who finally told her was not her mother at all, but a society figure, the famously sharp-tongued Margot Asquith. Other versions hold that she had learned earlier, perhaps in her middle teens, that the aunt was in truth her mother, and only later came to the fuller and harder truth about the prince. What every version of the story agrees upon, without exception, is the essential and damning fact. The knowledge came late, it came from outside the family, and it came as a blow. For the young woman at the very centre of it, the discovery was nothing like the romantic unveiling of a glamorous and royal parentage that a stranger might imagine. It was the sudden collapse of her entire understanding of herself, delivered second-hand by an outsider, after 20 unbroken years of being gently and consistently deceived by every single person she had ever trusted. She was, by the accounts that survive, deeply and lastingly wounded by the whole revelation, resentful both of the illegitimacy that had been hidden from her and of the long, patient deception that had hidden it. The aunt she had loved was abruptly her mother. The settled family story of her life was abruptly a careful fiction. And the dazzling Lillie Langtry, the mistress of stages and of princes, the face in every window, stood suddenly revealed as the woman who had borne her in a locked room, given her away to a false name, and then watched her grow up on an island for 20 years without ever once setting the record straight. There survives, from somewhere in this bitter reckoning between mother and daughter, a single remark attributed to Lillie that captures her entire character in one cold and unforgettable flash. When her daughter complained bitterly to her of the shame of her illegitimate birth, the mother is said to have answered her, "Who would you prefer to have as a father? A penniless, drunken Irishman or a royal prince, and the most handsome of all naval officers?" It is a remarkable thing to have said to a grieving and disoriented child, and it is remarkable in precisely the way that Lillie Langtry herself was remarkable. There is no apology anywhere in it, no softness, no flicker of acknowledgement of the 20 years of deception that had brought them both to that moment. There is only the brisk, unsentimental, faintly amused logic of a woman who had spent her entire life extracting the best possible deal from bad materials, now turned, with the same chilly efficiency, upon the wreckage of her own daughter's peace of mind. The relationship did not recover easily, and by several accounts, it did not ever fully recover at all. The natural closeness that might in another life have grown between a mother and a daughter had been spent, entirely and in advance, on the long and careful preservation of a secret. And what was left over once the secret finally broke was distance and hurt, and the plain, irreducible fact that the truth had arrived 2 decades too late to be anything other than a deep wound. The daughter would go on to build her own life, deliberately and quietly, in a completely different key from her mother's loud and glittering one. And a part of that life would always be defined in some measure against the famous woman who had borne her and hidden her. What makes the wound so lasting is that Jeanne Marie does not seem ever to have been able to fit the famous, dazzling public figure together with the private fact of having been given away. The rest of the world knew Lillie Langtry as a triumph, a self-made marvel, the girl from the island who had conquered everything. Her daughter knew her as the woman who had let her grow up under a false name and a false relation, and who, when finally confronted, had reached not for tenderness, but for that brisk little catalogue of the fathers on offer. The 2 pictures would not resolve into one. And so Jeanne Marie did the thing wounded people so often do, with a truth too large and too painful to carry openly. She folded it away and built her life deliberately around the fold, choosing privacy where her mother had chosen display, choosing silence where her mother had chosen the shop window, becoming in almost every particular the opposite of the woman who had made and hidden her. Here then, laid out plainly at last, was the true and final cost of the whole brilliant lifelong strategy. Every other transaction of Lillie Langtry's existence had, in the end, balanced its books. The plain black dress had bought the fame had bought the prince. The ruin, against all the odds, had bought the freedom. The stage and the long American tours had bought the great self-made fortune. Only this one single account refused, year after year, to balance, and it refused because the thing she had spent could never be replaced by anything she was able to buy. She had spent her own daughter's trust, all of it, at the very beginning, and no tour, and no triumph, and no fortune the new world could offer her was ever going to earn it back. And yet, in perhaps the strangest turn in the whole strange story, the very daughter she had so deeply wounded would one day choose, when at last her own moment came, to protect the secret that had been kept so cruelly from her. Chapter 12. The daughter marries and says nothing. In 1902, the secret child married a politician and carried her mother's secret quietly into a respectable life. The man Jeanne Marie chose, or was matched with, was Sir Ian Malcolm, a Scottish Conservative politician, and the wedding took place at St. Margaret's, Westminster, the parish church, standing in the very shadow of the great abbey, a setting as solidly and reassuringly respectable as the circumstances of her own birth had been irregular and hidden. With that single marriage, she stepped firmly and finally into the established order of things, the settled world of politics and county society and the church, the very world her grandfather the Dean had belonged to and her mother had so thoroughly scandalized. She made of her own life, deliberately, the thing her mother had never quite managed, or perhaps never wished to be, which was ordinary and respected and secure. She and Sir Ian had 4 children together, 3 sons and a daughter, and across the long decades of her marriage and her motherhood, she did the one thing that, in the cold light of everything that had been done to her, she had every conceivable right not to do. She kept the secret. She never publicly named her father, the prince whose blood she may have carried, the affair that had produced her, the whole astonishing story of the locked Paris room, and the borrowed name, and the aunt who had really been her mother. All of it she kept folded carefully away out of sight, declining to trade upon the royal connection that would have made her an instant sensation in the popular press, and declining, just as firmly, to expose the mother who had concealed her for 20 years. The daughter of the greatest self-promoter of the age chose, for her own part, a lifelong and deliberate silence. It is one of the quietly moving things in the whole sprawling story, this steady refusal to speak. Jeanne Marie had been handed every reason in the world to break it. She had been deceived for 20 years by everyone she trusted, wounded to the core by the manner of the revelation, and met with that cold and witty retort where an apology should have stood. She held in her 2 hands a secret that could have brought her attention, sympathy, perhaps a kind of public revenge upon the woman who had hidden her. And she simply declined to use any of it, whether her silence sprang from dignity, or from unhealed pain, or from a fierce desire to protect her own 4 children from the same glare she had suffered, or merely from a deep weariness with the whole exhausting affair. She carried the truth with her into a private life, and there she let it rest. The most famous woman in Britain had produced a daughter whose defining public act, across an entire long lifetime, was to say nothing at all. The descendants of that quiet and respectable marriage carried the bloodline forward into the new century, ordinary and unremarkable in exactly the way their grandmother had so spectacularly never been. One of Jeanne Marie's sons would in time marry an actress, a faint and very likely unconscious echo of the theatrical world the family had risen from and then turned its back upon. But for the most part, the children and the grandchildren of the Jersey Lillie's secret daughter lived the settled, comfortable, private lives of the established British upper class, their connection to one of the great scandals of the age held quietly within the family, if it was consciously held at all. Jeanne Marie herself lived on until 1964, dying at last in a world utterly transformed from the gaslit, horse-drawn, tightly corseted drawing rooms in which her own hidden story had first begun. There is a quiet dignity in the shape of the life she built that deserves to be named, because it stands in such deliberate contrast to her mother's. Sir Ian Malcolm was a serious man of public affairs, and the household Jeanne Marie made with him was settled, established, and entirely her own creation, founded on exactly the steady respectability her own beginnings had lacked. She raised her 3 sons and her daughter inside it. She took her place in the world of Westminster and the county houses, without ever once cashing in the extraordinary secret she carried. A secret that, in an age hungry for royal gossip, could have made her famous overnight had she chosen to spend it. That she never did is the clearest possible answer to the question of what kind of woman the hidden child had grown into. She had been raised on a lie and wounded by the truth, and she responded by becoming a person who could be trusted with a secret, which is to say the precise opposite of the mother who had kept one from her. But there is one more thread that has to be followed before the story can be allowed to close, and it is the very thread the whole title hangs upon, the claim that gives this long affair its astonishing reach right into the heart of the modern royal family. For if the acknowledged father truly was Prince Louis of Battenberg, and if the blood ran exactly as his family always insisted to the end that it did, then the secret child raised in obscurity on Jersey under a borrowed name was not merely the daughter of some half-forgotten prince. She was a near relation of figures who would one day stand at the very centre of the British monarchy, and the careful lie kept quiet on a small island reached, by the silent ties of blood, all the way to the steps of the throne itself. Chapter 13. The blood that may run to a prince. If the acknowledged father was indeed the true one, the secret child carried blood that reached the very heart of the royal family. The man at the centre of this final and most startling claim was Prince Louis of Battenberg, the young naval officer once carried away from her on the warship Inconstant, and the long arc of his later life turned him into one of the most consequential figures of the entire age. He rose steadily through the Royal Navy until he reached its very summit and became First Sea Lord, the professional head of the most powerful fleet in the world, only to be forced from that great office in 1914 at the very outbreak of the Great War, when his German birth and his German name made him suddenly an intolerable liability in a country at war with Germany. It was a cruel and undeserved end to a brilliant career, brought down at the last by the very foreign blood that had once made him such an exotic and desirable prize in a London drawing room. His family answered that wartime prejudice in 1917 with a single gesture that has echoed down through British history ever since. They shed the German name altogether and took an English one in its place. Battenberg was anglicised into Mountbatten, and Prince Louis himself was created Marquess of Milford Haven, remaking a German princeling into a British marquess at one stroke of the royal pen. And from that deliberate act of reinvention, there descended one of the most famous names of the entire 20th century. His son became Earl Mountbatten of Burma, the last Viceroy of India and a towering, controversial, and in the end, violently murdered figure of the post-war world. And his daughter, Princess Alice, married into the royal house of Greece and became, in the course of time, the mother of a boy named Philip, who would grow up to marry the young woman who became Queen Elizabeth II. Now lay the secret island daughter carefully against that glittering family tree, and the implication of it becomes genuinely startling. If Prince Louis of Battenberg truly fathered Jeanne Marie in that reckless summer of 1880, then Jeanne Marie was his daughter by blood, every bit as fully as the children of his proper marriage were, which would make her a half-sister to Princess Alice, and therefore a half-aunt to Prince Philip himself. The girl raised in deliberate obscurity on Jersey, taught from infancy to call her own mother her aunt, registered at birth under the name of a man who was emphatically not her father, would stand only a single step removed from the husband and consort of the British Queen. The lie kept so quietly in the long shadow of a Jersey deanery would touch, by the silent inheritance of blood, the most photographed and most scrutinized family on the face of the earth. But the whole dazzling structure rests entirely upon the small word, if, and plain honesty requires that the word be left standing in full view rather than quietly removed to make the story neater. The paternity was never certain, not then and not now. The letters to Arthur Jones, surfacing out of the past a full century later, planted a doubt that has never since been wholly cleared away, and the careful matching of dates that points toward Battenberg, however genuinely suggestive it is, falls short of being proof. The Mountbatten family believed it without question, and family belief, however firmly held across the generations, is simply not the same thing as established fact. So the royal blood that may run from the Jersey Lillie's secret child all the way to the heart of the monarchy has to be described exactly as the surviving evidence allows it to be described, as a striking and genuinely well-supported possibility, and never as a settled and provable truth. It is the single most extraordinary thing that might be true about Jeanne Marie Langtry, and, like so very much else in her strange and hidden story, it hovers always just short of certainty. There is something almost vertiginous in holding the two ends of this story together in the mind at once. At one end stands a clergyman's daughter on a small island in the Channel, marrying for a yacht because she could see no other way off the rock she was born on. At the other end stands the possibility that the child she bore in a locked Paris room and hid for 20 years behind a borrowed name was, by blood, a half-aunt of the man who would marry the Queen of England. The whole arc runs from a Jersey deanery to the steps of the British throne, and it runs through a single woman's refusal to be ruined and a single secret kept across 2 generations. Whether or not the final link in that chain is true, the fact that it is even arguable that serious historians and a powerful family have weighed it in earnest, tells you how far the consequences of one summer's recklessness in 1880 were able to travel down the years. Certainty, in the end, was the one thing this whole story was never able to offer, neither to the wounded daughter nor to the historians who came afterward trying to pin it down. And as the new century wore steadily on, and the great Victorian scandal faded slowly into half-remembered legend, the woman who had set the entire thing in motion all those years before was already moving, quietly and by her own deliberate choosing, back toward the small island where it had all first begun, to close the long circle of her life in the only place on earth that had ever truly been her own. Chapter 14. Buried in her father's churchyard. She married a baronet half her age, retired to the Riviera, and asked at the very end to be carried home to the island. The last act of Lillie Langtry's long and astonishing life carried within it a strange, late tenderness, mixed through, as always, with the same fierce independence that had marked every chapter that came before it. In 1899, with her first husband at last dead, she married for a second time, now to Sir Hugo de Bath, a baronet some 20 years younger than herself, and the wedding took place at St. Saviour's Church on Jersey. the very same church in which she had married Edward Langtry as a girl of 20, a full quarter of a century before. She was Lady de Bath now, titled at the last after a lifetime of being merely famous, though the second marriage was rather less a true partnership than a comfortable and convenient arrangement. And the two of them would spend most of their remaining years living largely apart, she on the Riviera and he not far from her, meeting only at intervals and otherwise leading wholly separate lives. She retired in time to the small principality of Monaco, to a villa she called Le Lys, the Lily, so that the very flower that had named her at the dazzling beginning of it all now named the house in which she would quietly end. She had sold her English properties and her racing interests, drawing the long and crowded public life gently to its close, and she lived out her final years in the soft southern light with her closest companion at her side. The woman who had once been the most looked at face in all of Britain spent her last seasons in a privacy and a quiet she had never once sought when she was young and hungry for the light, the cameras long gone, the princes dead or grown old. The great scandal, now only a faded story told about a woman who no longer much resembled the famous girl in the plain black dress. She died at dawn on the 12th of February 1929 in Monte Carlo of pneumonia at the age of 75. And here, at the very end, the long circle of the whole life finally drew itself closed, because her last clear wish was to go home. She had asked to be buried not on the glamorous southern coast where she happened to die, nor in the great London that had made her name and her fame, but in her own parents' tomb, in the quiet churchyard of St. Saviour on Jersey, in the very shadow of the deanery where she had been born, a clergyman's daughter, 3/4 of a century before. Winter storms delayed the long journey home, her coffin carried across rough grey water by steamer through the blizzards, until at the last she was laid to rest on the island of her birth, only a few steps from the church where she had been christened and married, the whole vast and improbable arc of her life folding quietly back at the end to its single small point of origin. Her secret daughter outlived her by some 35 years, dying in 1964, and to the very end, Jeanne Marie kept the silence she had chosen for herself, never once publicly naming the father whose contested identity had cost her so much of her peace. What survives now of the mother is, in a way, everything and nothing at once. The Millet portrait still hangs and is still admired. The photographs that once filled the shop windows of the whole country still surface in collections and archives. The island still tells her story to the visitors who come looking for the Jersey lily. And her own carefully composed memoir still survives too, describing her royal affair in soft and flattering outline while leaving out, entirely and very deliberately, the daughter and the secret birth and the locked Paris room. The most documented woman of her whole age authored, at the very last, the most carefully documented silence. For that, in the end, is the truth the entire life keeps circling back toward and refusing to release. Lillie Langtry mastered her own image more completely and more ruthlessly than almost any other figure of her century, turning a single face and a plain black dress and a sharp, unsentimental, unbreakable will into fame, into fortune, and into a freedom that her birth had never once been meant to allow her. She controlled what the world was permitted to see of her right down to the very last photograph. And the one single image she controlled most ruthlessly of all, across 2 full decades, was the one she never let the world see at all, the picture of herself as a mother, holding the daughter she had hidden away behind a borrowed name on a small island in the sea. The most photographed woman of her age kept one picture the world was never allowed to see. It is there still, if you go looking for it, in a quiet churchyard on Jersey, where the dean's daughter lies a few short steps from where she was born, and the secret she carried so long lies quietly down there in the dark beside her. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and come with me into the next story. And tell me in the comments, do you think Lillie protected that child or sacrificed her? And where in the world are you watching from? I read every reply, and yours is the reason this channel keeps telling these stories.